There is a particular feeling you get at 2 in the morning, lying still, replaying a conversation you had with someone you completely trusted, turning it over in your hands like a stone, looking for the crack you should have seen. Have you ever stood up for someone, defended their name in a room where others already doubted them, only to find out later they were quietly working against you the whole time? Have you ever opened yourself up to another person, handed them the most unguarded version of who you are, and watched them use it? Have you ever been the last one to know something that everyone around you apparently understood long ago? And have you ever sat with the worst question of all, that the signs were always there, and you chose, again and again, not to read them? That feeling isn't weakness. It's what happens when you encounter dangerous personality patterns that make betrayal an inevitable outcome. Not a surprise, not a one-time failure of character, but the destination a person was always moving toward, whether either of you realized it or not. The German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche spent much of his life doing something most people find uncomfortable, looking honestly at what drives human beings beneath the surface, what we actually do. And what he found was that betrayal rarely arrives without a long trail of warning. It has a behavioral footprint. It follows a logic. Certain configurations of personality don't just make disloyalty possible, they make it structurally inevitable, given enough time and enough pressure. There are 6 of these patterns, 6 portraits, and the frightening thing is that by the end of this, you will almost certainly recognize at least one of them in someone who already has access to you. That recognition is going to be uncomfortable, but it may also be the most useful thing you've encountered in a long time. If this sounds like something you needed to hear, subscribe. There's more where this came from. So let's begin. The first portrait. Number 1, the person whose admiration is actually a measurement. Nietzsche identified something he called ressentiment, and it's worth understanding precisely because this word gets used loosely. It doesn't just mean envy. It describes a specific psychological process. When a person cannot achieve what they desire, the energy doesn't dissipate. It turns inward, ferments, and eventually transforms into something systematic, a quiet, ongoing devaluation of the person who has what they lack. The observable pattern is subtle enough that most people miss it entirely. This individual celebrates your wins. They say the right things, but watch closely. The congratulations arrive a beat too slow, like a door closing just after someone's already left the room. Their questions about your success feel less like curiosity and more like calibration. They're measuring the gap between you and them. When something goes wrong for you, there is a half-second, almost invisible, where their expression softens before concern appears. Over time, their support develops a quiet friction. They frame your ambitions as risks. They remind you of past failures in the language of care. "I just don't want to see you get hurt again," said with total sincerity while gently pressing on the bruise. Nietzsche argued that this internal process doesn't stay contained. Resentment always finds an external outlet eventually. What begins as silent measurement becomes subtle friction, and friction, under enough pressure, becomes active interference. The person doesn't decide one morning to betray you. They arrive there by slow accumulation, each small act of devaluation making the next one easier to justify. The danger verdict here is stark. A person whose inner life is organized around measuring your distance above them will, when the gap becomes unbearable, begin working to close it from below. And here's what makes this pattern so disorienting. It often lives inside the people closest to you. Friends, sometimes family. But at least this one has a consistent direction. The next pattern is harder to track because the person shifts entirely depending on who's in the room. Number 2, the person with no fixed self. Nietzsche had a specific contempt for what he called the herd instinct, the tendency to abandon one's own values the moment social approval demanded something different. But he wasn't just describing conformity in the abstract. He was describing a particular kind of person, and their character signature is this: you cannot locate them. Every time you think you know who they are, the room changes, and so do they. Around you, they share your values. Around your rivals, they share theirs. In professional settings, they are polished, principled, even a little righteous. Behind closed doors, they are something else, looser, more self-serving, willing to say things you would never expect from the version of them you know. And the unsettling part is that none of these versions are performed consciously. They genuinely become whoever earns the most approval in a given room. The tell, once you know it, is hard to unsee. Pay attention to how this person talks about others when those others are absent. Every story shifts to flatter whoever holds the most social weight in the current conversation. Yesterday's close friend becomes a cautionary tale when that friend falls out of favor. They don't notice the contradiction, because for them, there is no contradiction. There is only the present audience. Nietzsche argued that loyalty is not just an emotion. It requires a stable self to exist, something consistent that persists across contexts, that holds its shape under pressure. Without that, loyalty becomes theoretically possible, but practically impossible. There is simply no one home to be loyal. The danger verdict. When your position in someone's life shifts, when you lose status, resources, or relevance, a person without a fixed inner center will reorient toward whoever now holds the advantage, and they will do it without drama, without guilt, and without fully understanding what they've done. That pattern involves a kind of absence, no core, no anchor. But the next one is different. This person has something, a story, and they will never, ever let it go. Number 3, the person whose suffering has become their permanent address. Nietzsche warned against a particular orientation toward life, one where a person transforms their grievances into identity rather than metabolizing them into growth. He took suffering seriously. What he was identifying was something more specific. The individual who has decided, somewhere beneath conscious awareness, that their pain is the most important and permanent fact about them. You meet this person and feel an immediate pull of compassion. Their story is hard. People have let them down, repeatedly, across every chapter of their life. Different jobs, different cities, different relationships, same outcome. And at first you think, this person just hasn't found their people yet. I could be different for them. So you try, you show up, you listen at odd hours, you absorb their weight and carry it alongside your own. But watch what happens the moment you have a need of your own, the moment you're unavailable, or you gently push back, or life simply demands your full attention elsewhere. The story shifts. Suddenly, you are not the exception. You are another name in the long record of people who abandon them. And they will believe this completely, without manipulation, without performance. That's what makes it so disorienting. Nietzsche argued that this orientation functions as a fortress. It protects the person from ever having to examine their own role in the patterns that keep repeating. Accountability never enters the room, because accountability would mean the story might change, and the story cannot change. It is all they have. The inevitable trajectory of this dynamic is predictable and painful. The moment you stop providing unconditional rescue, you become evidence of the very betrayal they always expected. They will describe what happened with total sincerity, and that sincerity will make it worse. Danger verdict. A person who has built their identity around being failed by others will, eventually, add your name to the list, and they will never understand why you find that unjust. The next portrait is louder. You'll hear this one coming if you know what sound to listen for. Number 4. The person who trades in other people's reputations. Nietzsche argued that the impulse to diminish others in conversation is rarely about the information itself. It's about power, a borrowed kind, the kind you acquire not by building something, but by controlling what others believe about someone else. When a person cannot generate status through their own efforts, they find a shorter route. They become the keeper of secrets, the one who always knows something you don't. You've met this person. They lean in slightly when they talk. Their voice drops just enough to signal that what follows is valuable, confidential, meant only for you. They frame it as concern. I just thought you should know. Or as honesty. I'm only telling you because I trust you. And it feels like intimacy. It feels like being chosen. But here's what research consistently shows. People who gossip frequently are rated significantly less trustworthy by their peers than those who don't. This isn't just a moral observation. It reflects something structural about their relationship to information. They treat it as currency, something to spend when the social transaction demands it. Watch the pattern closely. This person always has a new story. There is always another person being quietly taken apart, their choices questioned, their motives reframed, their private struggles turned into conversation. And they offer it so freely, so generously, that you almost don't notice you are watching someone demonstrate their operating system in real time. Nietzsche believed we should pay less attention to what people say about others and far more attention to the fact that they say it at all. The content changes. The willingness to trade in someone else's private life, that stays constant. That is the behavioral footprint that matters. Danger verdict. A person who brings you the vulnerabilities of others without hesitation is already collecting yours, and when the moment is right, yours will circulate just as easily. All 4 portraits so far involve someone consistently present in a particular way. What comes next is defined almost entirely by absence, and it may be the easiest pattern to rationalize away until the cost becomes undeniable. Number 5. The person who only surfaces when they need something. Nietzsche wrote about what he called relationships of utility, connections built not on genuine regard, but on hidden exchange, where one person is always providing and the other is always extracting, and the whole arrangement is dressed up in the language of friendship. He believed that people who see others primarily as functions rather than as human beings leave a very specific kind of damage behind them, one that's hard to name at first, because nothing dramatic ever happens. It just slowly becomes clear that you've been alone in this relationship for a long time. The pattern has a rhythm you'll recognize once you name it. This person disappears, weeks, sometimes months. Your calls go unanswered, your messages get short replies or none at all. You tell yourself they're busy, that life gets complicated, that you'd do the same if things were hectic. And maybe you would, occasionally. But then the contact comes, warm, familiar, like no time has passed. They ask about you first, which feels generous, but within a few exchanges, the ask arrives. A favor, an introduction, advice on something you know well, a loan that's framed as temporary. And here's what makes this pattern so corrosive. They may genuinely feel fond of you in that moment. The warmth isn't entirely false, but the warmth is also entirely conditional. It exists because you are currently useful, and it will evaporate, reliably, the moment you're not. Behavioral psychology has documented this pattern precisely. The alternating cycle of disappearance and reappearance correlates strongly with need state, not with genuine investment in the relationship. It is a documented precursor to abandonment. Specifically, the kind that happens when you actually need them and find the line goes dead. Nietzsche was clear that reciprocity is not optional in a trustworthy relationship. Without it, you are not in a friendship. You are a resource being managed. Danger verdict. A person whose presence tracks your usefulness will be completely absent at the precise moment your need is greatest, and that absence, when it arrives, is its own form of betrayal. We're almost through the portraits, but the last one may be the most unsettling of all, because unlike the others, you only discover it when the pressure is already at its highest. Number 6. The person who cannot govern themselves under pressure. Nietzsche placed self-mastery at the center of what he considered genuine strength. Not the suppression of emotion, he wasn't interested in stoic numbness. What he admired was the capacity to act from reason rather than react from impulse, to remain recognizably yourself when circumstances become difficult. He believed that a person who cannot exercise dominion over their own internal states is structurally incapable of being a reliable presence in anyone else's life. This one is easy to miss because the person looks entirely trustworthy in calm conditions. They are warm, engaged, sometimes fiercely devoted. You build real history with them. You start to feel genuinely safe. And then something shifts. Conflict enters the relationship. Or they face a public embarrassment, or resources become scarce. What appears instead is someone who assigns blame in proportion to their own discomfort rather than in proportion to actual events. Someone who makes decisions in anger that they cannot take back. Someone who withdraws without explanation or swings to the opposite extreme and becomes overwhelming. You start to notice that you've been managing their emotional state for a long time without realizing it. Calculating what you say, timing your disclosures, softening truths that shouldn't need softening. That careful management is itself a sign. You don't do that with people you feel genuinely safe around. Nietzsche argued that character is what remains when everything external is stripped away. Under real pressure, the kind that tests loyalty, not just patience, people without internal structure revert to self-preservation, simply because they have never built anything sturdier than their own comfort to stand on. Danger verdict. A person who cannot hold themselves together when things get hard will, at the precise moment your trust in them matters most, become someone you don't recognize, and that transformation is not a surprise if you know what to look for. 6 portraits, 6 different configurations, and yet they all share something, a single thread that runs through every one of them. That's what comes next. That thread, the one running through all 6, is this: past behavior is not a clue. It is a map. Behavioral psychology has confirmed what Nietzsche intuited long before the research existed. Past betrayal is one of the strongest single predictors of future betrayal, across relationships, across years, across entirely different social contexts. The circumstances change, the justifications change, the person standing across from you changes. But the underlying configuration, the willingness to prioritize personal benefit over given loyalty, that holds. It expresses itself in new situations with a consistency that, once you see it, becomes impossible to unsee. This is why the most important portrait in this gallery isn't one of the 6 you've already heard. It's the one you've been unconsciously constructing every time you notice something and talked yourself out of it. Think about it honestly. Every person described in these portraits left evidence. The silent measurer's hollow congratulations. The shapeshifter's slightly different face in every room. The permanent victim's readiness to rename you as a villain. The gossip's too easy generosity with other people's private lives. The transactional friend's warmth arriving precisely on schedule with a need. The emotionally volatile person's unfamiliar face under pressure. None of these arrived without signals. The signals were there. They were readable. Nietzsche argued that we should read people the way a careful observer reads tracks, not to judge, but to understand what is actually moving through the landscape, what is demonstrably, repeatedly, actually there. The employee who undermined a colleague to gain an advantage and told you about it as though it made them look capable. The friend who abandoned their previous circle the moment something better appeared and described it to you as growth. The partner who broke trust with someone else and called it love. Each one showed you their operating principle. Each one expected you not to apply it to yourself. Believe the principle before experience forces you to. Now, 6 portraits, 1 thread. But understanding these patterns is only half of what this is about. The more important question is what you actually do with that understanding, and that's where most people stop short. So look around, honestly, not with suspicion, with attention. Is there someone in your life whose support has always carried a faint friction you couldn't quite name? Someone who celebrates you with words that land slightly hollow, whose encouragement feels like it has a ceiling built into it. That's the first portrait. You know the feeling. You've probably explained it away more than once. Is there someone you've never been able to fully locate, who seems warm and principled around you, but you've noticed they're a slightly different person depending on who else is present? Someone whose position on things shifts with the room. You're not imagining that. The inconsistency you're sensing is real, and it has a direction. Is there someone whose life is a continuous record of being let down? Different circumstances, same outcome, always someone else's fault. Someone you've been quietly dreading disappointing because you already sense what that would look like. You already know how that story ends when your name gets added to it. Is there someone who knows an unusual amount about people you both know and shares it freely, warmly, as though it's a form of closeness? Notice how you feel after those conversations. Slightly uneasy, maybe, without being able to say exactly why. That unease is information. Is there someone who surfaces reliably when they need something and disappears just as reliably when you do? Someone whose warmth you've learned to treat as a signal that an ask is coming. That rhythm isn't coincidence. And is there someone who is everything you trust in them when life is smooth, but who has shown you, in moments of real pressure, a version of themselves that still unsettles you when you think about it too long? Nietzsche believed that the most demanding form of courage is perceptual. The willingness to see clearly what the evidence is actually showing you, even when the alternative, the comfortable interpretation, the generous reading, is right there, easier, warmer. You've been given the portraits. The harder question is what to do once you recognize the faces in them. What you do with the knowledge is this: you raise the standard. Not the wall, the standard. Nietzsche never argued for withdrawal. He had no patience for the person who, burned once, retreats behind suspicion and calls it wisdom. That, he believed, is its own kind of failure, replacing one vulnerability with another, trading the risk of betrayal for the certainty of isolation. What serves you is accuracy. The people who deserve your deepest trust are not the ones who have never been tested. They're the ones who had a clear and easy path toward self-interest, who could have taken it, who maybe no one would have noticed if they had. And they didn't. They chose you when it cost them something. That is the only evidence that actually holds weight. Everything else is performance, intention, or goodwill that hasn't been pressured yet. So the practice is simpler than it sounds. Stop extending trust as a default and start extending it as a recognition. Observe how people behave when something is at stake for them. Notice whether their loyalty has ever been inconvenient. Watch what they do, not what they say when the room is calm and there's nothing to lose. The dangerous personality patterns that make betrayal an inevitable outcome don't announce themselves. They accumulate quietly. In small moments, most people don't pause to read. But they do leave a trace. Every time. The person who carried that trace was already showing you who they were long before the moment that finally made it undeniable. You didn't fail to see it. You just hadn't yet learned what you were looking at. Now you have. The morning after you see someone clearly, really clearly, something settles, more like solid ground under your feet where there used to be something softer, less reliable. You move differently on it. If this gave you something worth keeping, subscribe for more and share it with someone who's been trying to name something they couldn't quite put into words.